Mithrix. A beautifully choreographed boss fight from beginning to end. A fight that gets your heart beating and arms tensed up as he charges towards you. It's a boss that takes thousands of hours to truly master with any survivor. But at the end of the day, history loves to repeat itself. Risk of Rain 2 is a broken game after all, and the top players love to break it even more. The King of Nothing's fight can and has been abused in the past. We've seen people escape the arena in multiple different ways, and then abusing the one-way wall that surrounds the fight afterwards. We've seen people lead Mithrix up the ramps and repeatedly fall damage him to death, and we've seen Captain do amazing things with his Diablo Strike, nullifying any chance that Mithrix can get a single attack out. But today, we're going to cover the single strongest tech against this boss that has ever been found. Let me introduce you to the Phase 1 skip. Now this is not a universal interaction. It's all about where each individual survivor's hurt box is located, and how big they are. Meaning the only survivors that we know of that can accomplish this tech are Commando, Huntress, Bandit, Merc, Void Fiend, Acrid, and Engie. These survivors are the only ones whose radii overlap with Mithrix's aim origin, which is shown as the red bubble around his head. The goal is to stand right on top of Mithrix, around his head and left shoulder area, so both your survivor hurt box and Mithrix's aim origin overlap. The interaction happens because of flaws when creating distance calculations and how they interact with Mithrix's attacks. The first flaw is actually an error in the way distances are compared between an enemy and a survivor, calculating distance from a position outside of the character's collider. Pairing this with an inaccurate equation for distance, we see that distance calculations can return a negative value when the possibility of a negative output should have been accounted for in the first place. This means that Mithrix thinks you are closer to him than you are, which for some survivors means you are actually a negative distance from him instead of an obvious positive distance. The instances in which Mithrix can use his abilities is limited to being a distance of 0 to infinity from you. These survivors that can perform this interaction are seen in Mithrix's eyes as less than 0 distance from him, taking advantage of his parameters that need to be met before using any actions that he has. Even when getting Mithrix below his threshold for jumping up and slamming back down into the ground, nothing is able to occur because of the combination of these flaws in the code. This tech uses this information as one of our best racers over at Risk of Resources, Zinc, jumped right on top of Mithrix in the middle of Phase 3. Ads spawning left and right, it was chaos trying to understand what was happening. This led us both to lab more and more practical instances where this could be applied for multiple hours. What I'm about to teach you is everything we could find so far. As always with any of my tech discoveries, there will always be new and improved ways to implement them, so test it out for yourself using helpful mods like Debugtoolkit to set up the perfect test environment like I did throughout this video. Now that we understand what this interaction is, it's time to learn the Mithrix Phase 1 setups. For starters, the Mithrix arena has a trigger area where the fight actually starts. Thanks to Nuxlar, the creator of Umbral Mithrix, we were able to whip up a quick mod to visually represent that for you guys. If you stay either far out enough away from the center or high enough in the arena, the fight will not be triggered. However, once you step inside that zone, you have 4 seconds before Mithrix comes landing down. And for the first setup, we're going to use just a single vase. All you need to do is shoot a vase right over the Mithrix spawn bubble, and use the interact button to drop out of it and land right on the bubble. Now where you position yourself isn't too precise, however you do need to be fairly accurate. Again, the goal is to already be standing above the general area of Mithrix's head and left shoulder area before he spawns in. Setup 2. 1 Milky Chrysalis. For this, you want to fly above the arena trigger area, constantly sprinting and pressing jump to gain the wing boost forward. Once you're about halfway to the center, angle diagonally downwards straight towards the bubble. Again, you have 4 seconds once you break that trigger area before you lose control of your survivor and the Mithrix cutscene begins. The wings stop flying once its cooldown hits 45 seconds, meaning you have only 15 seconds of full flight before slowing down drastically. Setup 3. 2 charges of Volcanic Egg. This one is a lot easier to get consistent, however you will need some form of fall damage prevention if you don't want to take some serious damage on the way down. The egg setup is similar to the wing setup. Fly up and over the arena trigger area, however now, instead of cutting through halfway straight to the bubble, you will keep flying above the trigger area until you reach right above the bubble. The arena ceiling has a very good indicator of when you reach the center, as the material all converges into a circular figure in the middle. Once you reach right above the bubble, all you need to do is just drop down right on it. This setup gives you the most time to find the correct positioning on the Mithrix bubble, since you don't break that arena trigger till the very end of the setup. So we know which survivors can do this tech, however let's cover something important. If you jump or move too much to one side, Mithrix will snap out of his dormant state. This means not every single skill can be used while performing this interaction. Let's start with Commando. Mando can use just about any ability he wants to deal damage. As long as you're not using either roll or slide, any other skill will land its attack on Mithrix. Huntress. Now her attacks require her to move a good amount. This means that only her primary attack is viable to maintain your hidden position. Her secondary glaive does work, however with just a single enemy in the area, it's not very desired to use since it won't bounce back and forth between 2 targets. Now Bandit is actually a really cool one. Burst, Blast, Lights Out, and Desperado work perfectly, while his utility Smoke Bomb will usually snap Mithrix out of his dormant state. But the real bread and butter for Bandit is that he can successfully use either of his secondary abilities as well. Pair this with the fact that you do have some wiggle room on top of Mithrix, you can position yourself perfectly for Bandit's passive Backstab. Bandit has the ability, with this tech, to constantly apply hemorrhage stacks over and over again without Mithrix jumping away at all, and guarantees crit on all of his other abilities while he's at it. Void Fiend. Anything but using either of Void Fiend's utilities or his corrupted secondary is free game. Both normal and corrupted primaries, specifically his uncharged normal secondary, both forms of suppress, and the action of transforming between his normal and corrupted state will maintain Mithrix's dormant state. As if Void Fiend wasn't busted enough as is, utilizing his corrupted form just became even easier. Merc. Now the only reason I've included Merc in this list is because there are instances where your build is carried by an equipment. Since all his abilities require him to move, they aren't a viable option for this tech. However, things like Capacitor, Crowdfunder, and other equipments are still completely usable, assuming you have enough movement items and skills to dash up and over the arena trigger, similar to the egg movement. Now on to the last 2 survivors, which do require a bit of a different setup. We discussed before that every survivor has a different hurtbox rigged for them, and Acrid's is a little funky. You have to imagine him holding a giant beach ball, which is his hurtbox, meaning instead of aligning where your feet are with Mithrix's head and left shoulder area, you want to position yourself so Acrid's neck and wrist area is what's positioned correctly instead. However, once you get this down, Acrid is free to use both of his secondary abilities and Epidemic to very successfully apply your desired passive, whether that be Poison or Blight. His primary attack can be used as well, however it creates a big risk of lunging too far forward and snapping Mithrix out of his dormant state. And finally, NG. This is honestly one of my favorites. One that me and Waxy, my trusty cameraman, had a lot of fun recording. Now NG can use either of the three equipments as his setup, but one thing NG can do is actually place a turret in that sweet spot as well. Now this becomes a bit tricky when using either the vase or wing setup, since you have less time to place your turret down accurately. However, the egg setup does give you a lot more time to get it down properly. Another thing is that if you place two turrets down in the same spot, or have your own body in the way, they will actually have their attacks hit each other's bodies and not land any attacks on Mithrix at all. For NG, you have two options. Either don't place any turret down at all, in which case NG's primary, spider mines, and harpoons work perfectly. When it comes to pressure mines, there's an annoying interaction where if you are next to an enemy while throwing the mine out, it will actually detonate on landing, regardless if the mine lands next to an enemy or not. Now the second option for NG is placing that single turret down in the correct position and letting it do all of the work for you. Now since the turret has the aggro, what this means is that you're chillin'. NG can hop right off of Mithrix, pull up a chair and crack a cold one, while his creation does all of the work for him. The most automated way to skip this entire phase, and it's honestly so ridiculous. However, if you use your skills, the swapping of aggro between your turret and yourself will also snap Mithrix out of this dormant state, so just be conscious of that. Similar to the aggro swapping of NG and his turrets, any drones or ally items that you may have can potentially mess this tech up unless those allies aren't dealing enough damage to Mithrix to take the aggro away from you. So things like Drone Man, Beetle Guard, Empathy Cores, and potentially higher cost drones like Incinerator Drone and TC-280 have the potential to stop this interaction from working. Now that the first phase of Mithrix is solved, let's apply this tech to other parts of the Mithrix fight. We've covered every setup for when Mithrix is at the very beginning of phase 1, but what if you mess up? We saw before that the first time this tech was done was actually in the middle of phase 3. Well, there's a big difference between successfully using this tech from the start of phase 1 compared to when Mithrix has already been activated. In order to pull this tech off mid phase 1 or any part of phase 3, there is an extra step that needs to be met. You need to make Mithrix unable to move while standing on top of him. This is where Tentabobble comes into play. A 5% chance to root an enemy on hit. An item that stacks in both percent chance increase and duration the more you have. This is the solution to Mithrix snapping out of his dormant state when already activated. Now this is still not an easy task. Not only is Mithrix actively trying to attack you, but you have to know when and how to get on top of him successfully. This will either require movement skills or some feathers to be successful, and the risk gets even higher when attempting this during any part of phase 3. Not only is Mithrix actively seeking you out, but he has even more skills in his kit, and there are constant lunar chimeras spawning in and attacking you in the process. Unless you have absurd AoE and a very high proc rate that is strong enough to both kill all the ads that spawn in and maintain the Tentabobble route on Mithrix, you will not be able to do this. Although the tech can be used on every phase of Mithrix, the prerequisites and the risks are probably too high to survive an attempt during phase 3. Which brings us to our last phase, Mithrix phase 4. Similar to how risky our phase 3 setup can be, Mithrix now has every single one of your items while you have nothing. The interaction during phase 4 is slightly different, in that instead of Mithrix standing completely still, he will be trying to walk towards you. However, if you stand far enough towards his front while still being on top of him, it is possible to whittle him down without his needle attacks being able to hit you. This phase 4 setup is very risky, and you do have a high chance of him moving out of it eventually. Whether you consider this interaction a tech or an exploit, it is still something amazing to see discovered in this game. Always draw your own lines on what interactions you want to use in your runs, not letting others dictate that for you. For more information on how I conducted my testing, I'll throw a link to the mod used, and any specific commands to further help you test it for yourself. Big shout out again to Zinc for initially discovering this tech, alongside Nuxlar and Sixth Moon for helping out a ton on the modding side of things, and helping me further understand what actually makes this tech work. Make sure to give this video a like and subscribe if you found it informative and helpful. And for any Risk of Rain game that comes our way, know that I'll be there to share incredible new discoveries.